In Ontario's outlaw biker world, rivalry is not new. The Hells Angels built a province-wide machine backed by chapters, support clubs, and decades of dominance. The Loners built something harder to erase, smaller in scale but rooted, independent, and unwilling to fold into anyone else's system. That difference has fueled clashes before between the gangs. Fights over territory, recruitment battles, explosions, shootings, and targeted violence were common over the years. These conflicts reached its peak, and when old rivals with unfinished business start moving again, the violence feels like a reckoning. The rise of the Loners and the first fracture. The Loners Motorcycle Club was formed in 1979 in Woodbridge, Ontario, at a time when the province's outlaw motorcycle landscape was divided among multiple independent groups rather than controlled by a single dominant organization. Frank Lenti and Jaro Rosso established the club with a clear structure from the beginning. Membership required sponsorship, prospects were required to prove loyalty over time, and American-made motorcycles were mandatory. The club was not designed as a casual riding group. It was organized with long-term growth in mind. Throughout the 1980s, the Loners expanded beyond Woodbridge into Toronto, London, and other cities in southern Ontario. Unlike clubs that grew quickly and fractured under pressure, the Loners maintained centralized leadership. Decisions flowed upward, discipline flowed downward. Internal disputes were handled firmly to prevent splits. That internal cohesion allowed them to grow steadily without collapsing under rivalry or internal betrayal, something that weakened other Ontario-based clubs during that era. By the late 1980s, the Loners had become one of the largest outlaw motorcycle clubs in Ontario. Their presence extended into businesses linked to members and associates, including bars, tattoo shops, and adult entertainment venues. Law enforcement intelligence reports increasingly connected the club to cocaine distribution networks operating through the Greater Toronto Area and into southwestern Ontario. Their structure was no longer seen as informal. It was recognized as organized. The 1990s strengthened that position. Chapters were established outside Canada, including in Europe and parts of the United States. Those expansions were not symbolic. They created supply connections and strengthened alliances beyond provincial borders. Within Ontario, the Loners controlled significant territory tied to narcotics distribution and local influence. Their independence became central to their identity. They were not subordinate to another club. They operated under their own banner and answered to their own leadership. During this same period, the Hells Angels were expanding strategically across Canada, but had not yet formally consolidated Ontario. Quebec had already seen violent conflict between the Hells Angels and the Rock Machine during the 1990s, a conflict that left more than 160 people dead. Ontario remained comparatively fragmented. Quebec-based Hells Angels members visited Ontario regularly, attending gatherings and building relationships with local clubs. In June of 1993, Walter Stadnick, the Hells Angels national president, hosted a major gathering in Wasaga Beach, attended by multiple Ontario biker clubs. The Loners were present. The event was not random socializing. It was part of a long-term strategy. The Hells Angels were exploring expansion through patchovers rather than immediate violence. Smaller clubs were encouraged to join the Hells Angels structure in exchange for security and access to broader networks. Frank Lenti declined. The Loners did not patch over. Instead, a business relationship was formed in which the Loners agreed to purchase narcotics through Hells Angels supply channels. For several years, that arrangement functioned. The Loners maintained independence while conducting business with Quebec-based Angels. The balance held through the mid-90s. By 1999, the balance shifted. The Hells Angels began preparing for formal Ontario consolidation. Smaller clubs were approached and quietly absorbed. Internal weaknesses within independent chapters were identified and exploited. The strategy was deliberate. Rather than attack directly, fractures were encouraged from within. Attention turned toward the Loners London chapter. John Coates, a member of the Hells Angels Sherbrooke chapter in Quebec, entered the picture. Coates was physically imposing and well-connected within the Quebec structure. His brother, Jimmy Coates, was a member of the Loners London chapter. That family connection created access. Through that connection, Narcotics were supplied directly to selected London Loners members without going through chapter president Wayne Kellerstein. The arrangement bypassed leadership and created internal division. Members who participated were effectively stepping outside their own chain of command. When Kellerstein discovered the arrangement, he responded immediately. Members involved were stripped of their colours, an internal disciplinary action that removed their standing within the club. One member was assaulted and robbed for his participation. The fracture was no longer private. It became visible within outlaw circles. Tension escalated rapidly. The London infiltration. By 1999, pressure inside Ontario's biker environment was no longer abstract. The Loners were still independent, but the province around them was shifting. Smaller clubs were quietly being approached by the Hells Angels. Conversations were happening away from official meetings. Loyalties were being tested without formal declarations. London became the testing ground. The London chapter of the Loners was not minor. It sat in a strategic position between the Greater Toronto Area and the southwestern corridor that connected to Windsor and the United States border. Narcotics moved through that region. Money moved through that region. Whoever controlled London held leverage. John Coates entered the picture during this period. A member of the Hells Angels Sherbrooke chapter in Quebec, Coates had weight inside the organization and direct access to Ontario through family. His brother, Jimmy Coates, was a Loners member in London. That connection mattered because infiltration does not begin with force, it begins with familiarity. Through Jimmy, conversations started between certain London Loners members and Hells Angels contacts. The arrangement was built around supply. Narcotics could be sourced more directly and potentially at better margins if certain members were willing to bypass chapter leadership. That bypass was not a technicality. It cut directly across the authority of Wayne Kellerstein, who was president of the London chapter at the time. The infiltration did not happen in a single meeting. It developed gradually. Members who participated were not announcing a patchover. They were participating in side arrangements that undercut their own leadership. Each transaction weakened internal cohesion. Each secret meeting created another crack. Eventually, Kellerstein became aware that members of his own chapter were meeting with Hells Angels contacts behind his back. The reaction was immediate and public within the chapter. Colors were stripped from those involved. That act was not symbolic. It removed standing. In biker culture, removing someone's patch is a declaration that loyalty has been broken. One member was assaulted and robbed as punishment for participating in the side arrangement. Once that internal discipline became known beyond the chapter, the conflict moved from quiet maneuvering to open hostility. On October 22, 1999, Wayne Kellerstein was driving near Iona Station in rural Ontario. He stopped at a red light. A vehicle pulled alongside his truck. Inside were two men associated with the Hells Angels. A shotgun was fired into Kellerstein's vehicle at close range. The blast shattered the window and tore through the truck. Glass scattered across the interior. Despite the proximity, Kellerstein survived. The attempted shooting did not end in a fatality, but it eliminated any ambiguity about where the conflict stood. The infiltration had failed to flip the chapter quietly. The response had escalated to attempted murder. Police responded quickly. The scene was processed. Evidence was collected from the vehicle and roadway. Investigators identified suspects linked to the attack. John Coates, Jimmy Coates, and others were arrested and charged with conspiracy-related offenses tied to the incident. The charges initially reflected the severity of the act. Over time, plea agreements reduced some of the original counts, but jail time followed. The arrests did not repair the damage inside the Loners. The London chapter had already been fractured publicly. Members had been stripped of colours. An attempted assassination had taken place. Law enforcement attention intensified around individuals connected to both sides. Meetings became harder to conduct without surveillance risk. Communication tightened. Inside the broader outlaw environment, the message was clear. The Hells Angels were willing to push beyond persuasion if infiltration failed. The Loners had demonstrated they would discipline their own members rather than surrender authority quietly. The two organizations were no longer in a business arrangement. They were in open conflict. The London chapter never fully recovered its internal stability after the shooting attempt. Even though Kellerstein survived, Trust had been damaged. Some members feared further escalation. Others questioned whether standing alone against the expanding Hells Angels structure was survivable. Conversations about patching over did not disappear simply because arrests had been made. For the Hells Angels, the infiltration revealed something valuable. It showed that internal fracture was possible. It showed that some Loners members were willing to bypass leadership. Even though the London chapter did not flip at that moment, the groundwork for broader provincial pressure had been tested. Throughout late 1999, surveillance and intelligence gathering intensified across southwestern Ontario. Organised crime units monitored movement between London and Quebec. The attempted shooting and subsequent arrests created court proceedings that extended into the next year. While the legal process moved forward, the strategic landscape continued shifting behind the scenes. The infiltration of the London chapter did not end with the shooting. It weakened the Loners at a critical time. When the Hells Angels prepared for formal Ontario consolidation at the end of 2000, they did so knowing that one of the Loners' key chapters had already been destabilized. The attempted assassination of Wayne Kellerstein marked the end of quiet maneuvering. After October 1999, the conflict could no longer be contained within private meetings or internal discipline. The fracture was visible, the police were involved, the outlaw community was watching. When the mass patchover took place on December 29, 2000, the London chapter entered that moment, carrying unresolved damage from the infiltration that had begun a year earlier. The Loners remained independent, but they were no longer entering the new era from a position of full internal strength. The takeover of Ontario would not begin with an explosion. It would begin with a weakened rival and a province already divided. The mass patch over.
I believe they started in Ontario. By their very name, the Loners, they are a loner group. They are not a support club to other motorcycle gangs. They do affiliate with some and others with not. And obviously in this recent incident, there's a conflict with one of the other outlaw motorcycle gangs, which is always our concern, that these criminal groups operating in Ontario, sharing the same geographical region, the chance for conflict is high.
By late 1999, the pressure across Ontario's biker landscape had already begun shifting, but the province was still fragmented. Multiple independent clubs operated across major cities. Alliances existed, but there was no single banner controlling Ontario as a whole. That changed on December 29, 2000. That day, 179 bikers from several Ontario-based clubs traveled to Sorel, Quebec, for a coordinated patchover ceremony arranged by the Hells Angels. This was not a slow move where one small chapter flipped and everyone waited to see what came next. It was organized in a way that changed the map all at once. Men arrived wearing one identity and left wearing another, and the numbers mattered because it meant Ontario did not have time to adjust gradually. Satan's Choice was at the center of that shift. Other clubs were pulled into it as well, including Paradise Riders and the Last Chance Motorcycle Club, and the overall outcome was the same. Multiple clubs that once stood as independent Ontario banners were effectively erased and replaced inside one larger structure. After that day, Ontario did not just have Hells Angels visiting from Quebec or dealing through business ties. Ontario now had a full Hells Angels presence, built from the ground up, using local manpower that already knew the province. When that many riders patched over at once, it meant several things happened immediately, without waiting for a long build-up. Clubhouses that used to belong to Ontario clubs now became Hells Angels spaces. People who had once been rivals became brothers under one banner, at least on paper. Local contacts, local hangouts, and local money routes did not need to be discovered because they were already known by the men who had been operating in those cities for years. The Hells Angels did not need to create an Ontario footprint from scratch. It was handed to them through conversion. It also meant the balance shifted inside a single winter. Instead of a province where different clubs could still argue over space, Ontario became a province where one banner could coordinate across cities. That coordination is what makes a patchover different from a typical alliance. A loose alliance might hold until someone feels disrespected. A patchover locks everything into a chain of command. That is what made this dangerous for anyone who stayed outside it, because the pressure stopped being local pressure, it became provincial pressure. After the ceremony, the practical changes started showing up fast. Public rides featured new colors. Meetings happened with new rules. Support clubs began realigning because support clubs follow power. Prospects who would have once joined a mid-level Ontario club now saw the top-tier patch sitting in the province, not just passing through. That shifts recruitment. It shifts loyalty. It shifts who gets protected and who gets isolated. The Hells Angels did not need to announce a war across Ontario that week. They did not need to hold a press conference or make a public claim. Their move was structural. They built a province-wide base in a single day, and once that base existed, every independent club had to live under a new reality. The Loners did not patch over. That mattered more after December 29th than it would have mattered a few years earlier. Before the patchover, the Loners were one strong independent club among several Ontario clubs with real presence. After the patchover, the Loners became one of the only remaining banners in Ontario that still had weight and still refused to fold. Their refusal was no longer just stubborn pride. It became a visible exception to the new rule being set across the province. In the weeks and months that followed, pressure did not come in one form. Some of it was about territory and public presence. Some of it was about business and supply. Some of it was about identity, the way patches represent space. The point was not to have one dramatic confrontation every day. The point was to make it clear who had authority to exist openly. That is where the territorial rocker issue came into play. The Loners were told they did not have the right to wear Ontario as a territorial claim. The demand was not just about words on leather. It was a way of forcing a choice without needing a gunfight on the spot. If the Loners removed the rocker, it would look like acceptance of a lower status in the province. If they refused, it would set up a direct conflict over who could claim the province at all. Inside the Loners, the reaction was not uniform. They were not one man making one decision for every chapter without consequences. Chapters had different risk levels. Some members were looking at the new map and thinking in practical terms because they understood how quickly clubs could be erased when a larger structure moved in. Other members were committed to the Loners' identity and saw removal of territory as surrender that would never stop at one concession. This is the part that gets missed if you only look at it like a simple rival story. Patchover consolidation changes the math for everyone. If you are a smaller club, you either attach yourself to power or you get crushed between power structures. If you are a bigger independent like the Loners, you become a target, not because you are weak, but because you represent the last visible refusal that others can point to. It also changed how violence would show up in Ontario. Because after the patchover, every incident carried a different weight. If a business connected to a rival group burned, it was not just a local beef. It was part of a province-wide enforcement environment. If a member was assaulted, it was not always a random fight. It was often tied to the larger question of who could operate openly and who had to retreat. By early 2001, southwestern Ontario began seeing that pressure grow more visible. London stayed central because it sat in a corridor that mattered, and because it had already been destabilized in the months before the patchover. The patchover did not create London's problem. It made London's problem more dangerous because now the dominant structure had the ability to move support and coordinate action across the province. Other cities shifted too. Toronto did not remain a neutral ground where multiple banners operated at equal weight. Hamilton did not remain a place where old clubs could hold space if they were outside the dominant structure. Smaller hubs that sat on travel routes began feeling the pressure in a quieter but more constant way. When a dominant organization takes root in multiple cities, it does not need to fight for every corner every week. It can pressure the corners slowly and steadily until resistance breaks. That is also why patchover strategy was so effective in Ontario compared to open war tactics. Quebec had already shown how messy open war could get. Ontario's conversion move avoided some of that mess at the start. It created dominance without forcing a year of daily shootouts immediately. It also made it harder for rivals to form a united front because the province's old landscape no longer existed. The clubs that could have resisted were now inside the dominant banner. For anyone still outside, the options narrowed quickly. Some patched over, some broke apart. Some looked for protection under rival banners that could stand against the Hells Angels. That is where the Bandidos began becoming a more serious factor in Ontario, because they were one of the only major international rivals that could offer a counterweight, at least in theory. By the end of 2000, the takeover had already happened on paper. By early 2001, it began expressing itself in day-to-day reality. The main difference was that Ontario no longer had a flexible map, it had a hierarchy. The reason December 29th, 2000 remains, the key date is simple. It was the day Ontario stopped being a province of multiple competing outlaw clubs with roughly balanced pockets of power. It became a province where one banner established wide dominance quickly. It became a province where one banner established wide dominance quickly, with local manpower and local infrastructure already in place, and where every club that remained outside that structure had to decide whether they would fold, fight, or attach themselves to a rival banner. That decision point is what set up the violence that followed in 2001 and 2002. The arsons, the targeted attacks, the shootings that began surfacing more openly in southwestern Ontario were not random chaos that appeared out of nowhere. They grew out of the new map created by the patchover. Ontario did not need a formal declaration of war to enter a war period. The patchover itself was the opening move, and everything that followed was shaped by the simple fact that one organization had planted itself across the province in a single coordinated act. The Ontario Biker War. After the mass patchover reshaped Ontario at the end of 2000, the province did not explode instantly. The shift had already happened at the structural level. What followed in 2001 and 2002 was the visible enforcement phase. Southwestern Ontario carried most of that pressure, and London remained at the center of it. By early 2001, businesses connected to rival biker factions began feeling the strain. Tattoo shops known to be associated with certain members were set on fire. Strip clubs linked to club revenue streams were targeted. Massage parlors believed to be tied to biker-controlled income were burned. These were not random property crimes, they were calculated strikes aimed at income and reputation. Fire damaged more than buildings, it damaged credibility. London saw repeated confrontations in bars and public spaces where rival members crossed paths. Assaults followed. Police responded to fights that were not isolated scuffles but tied to deeper alignment conflicts. Surveillance around known clubhouses increased. Organized crime units began dedicating more resources to tracking who was meeting with whom, which vehicles were moving between cities, and which businesses were operating as fronts. In June 2001, the Outlaws' Woodstock Clubhouse was destroyed by fire. The Outlaws had long-standing presence in Ontario, and while they were not always directly aligned with the Loners or the Hells Angels during every incident, the broader climate of consolidation and pressure meant they were operating in the same unstable environment. When a clubhouse burned, it signaled that no building connected to an outlaw banner was beyond reach. Throughout late 2001, southwestern Ontario experienced a pattern of targeted violence. Vehicles connected to rival members were vandalized or damaged. Confrontations escalated beyond fists. Weapons began appearing more frequently during disputes. The conflict did not unfold as a single running battle. It unfolded as a series of targeted moves that created an atmosphere of instability. On January 11, 2002, the escalation crossed into more direct firearm violence. 2 men associated with the Hells Angels were shot in London. They survived, but the incident marked a shift from property damage and assaults to open gunfire. The same day, a massage parlor in St. Thomas, linked to the biker environment, was set on fire. The timing connected the two events in the eyes of investigators and residents alike. Emergency crews responded to both scenes. Police sealed off areas and began gathering evidence. Forensic teams processed shell casings. Fire investigators examined the St. Thomas property for accelerants and ignition points. The message inside law enforcement circles was clear. The conflict was no longer contained to intimidation. The weeks that followed saw intensified police activity. Search warrants were executed at properties tied to suspected club members. Firearms were seized during certain operations. Arrests were made on weapons-related charges. Bail hearings placed conditions on association and travel. Organized crime units worked across municipal lines to prevent retaliatory cycles from spiraling further. London did not return to calm immediately. Reports of assaults and threats continued. Businesses believed to be aligned with one faction or another operated under constant risk. Patrons of certain establishments were questioned by police. The public began seeing uniformed presence more often near locations associated with biker activity. At the same time, rival alignments hardened. The Bandidos' presence in Ontario, strengthened by those unwilling to patch over to the Hells Angels, created a counterweight in southwestern Ontario. That alignment did not produce a balanced standoff. It created tension layered on top of existing rivalries. Members who had once operated under one banner now found themselves in direct opposition to former associates. By mid-2002, the conflict had produced enough incidents to draw sustained media attention. The phrase "biker war" began appearing more frequently in reporting. Residents in parts of southwestern Ontario became aware that the instability was not a single weekend flare-up, but a prolonged struggle tied to territorial control. Law enforcement did not treat the situation as isolated criminal acts. Organised crime task forces coordinated between London Police Service, the Ontario Provincial Police, and other regional services. Intelligence sharing increased, undercover operations expanded, surveillance on key figures intensified. Despite the violence, the province did not see daily open gun battles across cities. The conflict remained concentrated in areas where resistance still existed. The Hells Angels' advantage during this period came from cohesion. Their chapters communicated across Ontario. If pressure increased in London, reinforcement could move from other cities. That flexibility reduced the likelihood of them being overwhelmed in a single location. The Bandidos' structure in Ontario, while present and visible, did not operate with the same provincial depth. Internal disagreements surfaced over direction and leadership. That instability would later contribute to larger consequences, but during 2001 and 2002, the immediate effect was uneven resistance. Property damage continued sporadically. Businesses were forced to repair fire damage or shut down. Insurance investigations overlapped with criminal investigations. Courts processed assault and weapons charges tied to the ongoing conflict. Community members near targeted properties lived with uncertainty about whether the next escalation would land near them. By late 2002, the frequency of visible incidents began slowing. Arrests and increased surveillance limited the ability of rival groups to move openly. The most volatile phase of the Ontario biker war had passed its peak, but the damage was already done. Southwestern Ontario had absorbed months of targeted violence tied to a structural power shift that began with the mass patchover. The period between 2001 and 2002 did not produce the body count seen in Quebec's earlier conflict, but it permanently altered how outlaw clubs operated in Ontario. It established that consolidation would be enforced. It demonstrated that independent resistance carried real cost. It forced law enforcement into long-term organized crime monitoring across multiple municipalities. When the open violence cooled, the hierarchy created by the December 2000 patchover remained intact. Rival structures had been weakened or destabilized. The next major rupture would not come from open confrontation between the Hells Angels and external rivals, but from instability within one of the organizations that attempted to stand against them. That rupture would arrive in 2006. The Bandidos' collapse. By the time Ontario reached 2005, the open street-level escalation of the earlier biker conflict had slowed, but the tension inside certain clubs had not. The Bandidos Motorcycle Club had expanded its Ontario footprint during the early 2000s, drawing in members who had refused to align under the Hells Angels banner. Southwestern Ontario became their strongest corridor, particularly around London and surrounding rural areas. On the surface, the club appeared structured. Chapters met regularly. Leadership positions were assigned. Patches were worn openly. But internally, fractures were growing. The Ontario Bandidos were not operating with the same unified structure seen inside the Hells Angels. Disputes surfaced over authority and direction. Some members questioned decisions made by leadership. Others believed discipline had weakened. Meetings became more heated. Allegations circulated about members not following orders, mishandling finances, or speaking out of turn. Loyalty in outlaw motorcycle clubs is not a soft concept. When leadership begins questioning loyalty, the consequences rarely stay verbal. In early April 2006, a mandatory meeting was called for members of the Ontario Bandidos. The gathering point was a rural property near Shedden, Ontario, and rural meeting locations were not unusual. They provided privacy and space away from public observation. Members traveled from different parts of the province, expecting a club discussion. Instead, the meeting became an execution site. On April the 8th, 2006, 8 Bandidos members were killed at that property. They were shot, and their bodies later transported in vehicles before being discovered in a field. The number alone stunned investigators. 8 bodies in one location, tied to the same outlaw motorcycle club, represented one of the largest mass homicide cases in provincial history. Police responded quickly once the vehicles were located and the bodies identified. The rural scene was secured and processed extensively. Forensic teams collected shell casings, examined blood patterns, documented tire impressions, and traced vehicle movement. The investigation expanded across multiple jurisdictions because members involved had traveled from different cities. Interviews began almost immediately. Surviving members were questioned, associates were tracked, phone records were obtained. Surveillance footage from highways and nearby towns was reviewed to reconstruct travel routes before and after the meeting. Organized crime units coordinated with homicide investigators to piece together how a club meeting escalated into mass murder. Arrests followed in stages. Senior Bandidos figures in Ontario were charged with first-degree murder. Court documents outlined allegations that the meeting had been used to remove members considered disloyal or problematic. The prosecution later described the killings as an internal purge intended to restore control through fear. The scale of the case required extensive courtroom proceedings. Preliminary hearings stretched over months. Evidence included forensic reports, recorded communications, witness testimony, and physical exhibits recovered from the scene. Trials continued over several years, with convictions resulting in life sentences for key participants. The judicial process did not move quickly, but it moved thoroughly. The impact on the Bandidos' presence in Ontario was immediate and severe. 8 members were dead. Several others were imprisoned, awaiting trial or serving sentences. Leadership structure collapsed. Recruitment slowed dramatically. The club's ability to operate openly in southwestern Ontario was crippled. Law enforcement pressure increased across the province following Shedden. The public shock surrounding the killings pushed organized crime enforcement higher on the priority list. Police executed additional warrants at properties linked to outlaw motorcycle activity. Financial investigations examined businesses suspected of laundering money. Firearms enforcement intensified. Known clubhouses were monitored more aggressively. For the Hells Angels, no public confrontation was required during this period. The removal of the Bandidos as a stable rival structure occurred internally. The provincial balance that had been contested earlier in the decade shifted further towards singular dominance. Chapters that had once faced credible opposition in certain corridors now operated without the same organized counterweight. The loners remained active during this time, but they were not positioned to mount large-scale opposition. Their survival depended more on maintaining presence without triggering sustained retaliation. Chapters existed, identity remained intact, international ties provided some stability, but the Ontario landscape had changed again. Community reaction to Shedden extended beyond the outlaw motorcycle world. Rural residents were confronted with the reality that organized crime conflicts had unfolded in farmland near their homes. Media coverage detailed the brutality of the killings and the internal conflict that led to them. Public perception of biker clubs hardened further. The Shedden massacre did not reignite province-wide street warfare. Instead, it closed a chapter. The most visible organized resistance to Hells Angels' dominance in Ontario collapsed under internal violence. Court proceedings continued into the late 2000s, but the structural outcome was clear much earlier. By the end of 2006, Ontario's outlaw motorcycle hierarchy was no longer contested in the same way it had been earlier in the decade. The Hells Angels maintained established chapters across major cities. Support clubs continued feeding into the structure. Law enforcement maintained surveillance and enforcement programs, but the open, multi-banner struggle of the early 2000s had ended. The collapse of the Bandidos in Ontario was not a loud, prolonged firefight between rival organizations. It was a concentrated internal implosion that reshaped the province's criminal landscape. The consequences were measured not only in prison sentences and deaths, but in the absence of a structured rival capable of challenging the dominant banner. After Shedden, Ontario entered a quieter phase. The hierarchy held. Violence did not disappear, but it no longer took the form of sustained open war between multiple organized banners. The next chapter of tension would build slowly over years, not in a single meeting in a rural field. The Loners survive. After 2006, Ontario did not erupt again. The loudest chapter of the conflict had ended with prison sentences and funerals. The Hells Angels structure remained in place across the province. Support clubs continued operating in cities that had once been contested. Law enforcement maintained organized crime units dedicated to monitoring biker activity. On paper, dominance looked settled. The Loners did not disappear. They did not hold large public rides designed to challenge the new order. They did not announce expansion inside Ontario during that period. Instead, they shifted their strategy. Survival became less about visible defiance and more about maintaining identity without triggering direct confrontation. Chapters continued operating in Ontario, but activity became more controlled. Public presence was measured. Known meeting spots were used carefully. Recruitment did not stop, but it slowed and tightened. Prospects were screened more cautiously. In an environment where one banner had established wide dominance, reckless visibility invited pressure. Internationally, the Loners maintained and expanded connections outside Ontario. Chapters in other countries continued functioning, and that international presence mattered because it preserved the club's legitimacy beyond provincial politics. While Ontario had shifted structurally, the Loners were not a small local crew. They had reached beyond Canada. That broader network gave them breathing room that purely regional clubs did not have. Within Ontario, the club focused on stability. Internal discipline tightened. Meetings emphasized cohesion. Members who had seen the fracture during the London infiltration and the broader biker war understood what internal weakness could cost. The club could not afford another public split. Loyalty was reinforced through structure rather than spectacle. The mid-2000s through the early 2010s did not produce regular headlines about Loners' clashes with the Hells Angels. That absence was not accidental. It reflected a phase where overt confrontation was avoided. Operating quietly in a province dominated by a larger structure required calculation. The Loners did not remove their identity. They maintained their patches, but they navigated space carefully. Law enforcement presence remained consistent during this period. Organized crime units monitored outlaw motorcycle clubs broadly, not just one banner. Search warrants were executed periodically across the province, targeting narcotics distribution, firearms possession, and alleged money laundering operations. Arrests involved members from different clubs at different times. The enforcement pressure applied across the environment kept activity from escalating into open territorial battles. Cities like Cambridge, Cornwall, and Brockville saw Loners' presence continue quietly. Clubhouses operated, though not with the same open posture that had characterized earlier decades. Events were held, but with lower public visibility. The goal was not to reclaim Ontario through visible defiance. The goal was to remain intact. The Hells Angels continued expanding support club networks during this period. The Red Devils and other aligned groups grew in certain areas. That growth mattered because support clubs serve as both recruitment pipelines and buffers. The more support clubs exist, the more difficult it becomes for independent banners to expand openly without drawing attention. The Loners adapted by strengthening internal loyalty rather than chasing rapid expansion. Prospects were required to demonstrate commitment over longer periods. Public social media presence remained minimal compared to newer, more reckless outlaw groups that emerged later in the decade. Older members who had lived through the war years understood that visibility carried risk. By the early 2010s, Ontario's outlaw motorcycle landscape had settled into a hierarchy that appeared stable. The Hells Angels operated openly across major corridors. The Loners existed, but did not attempt broad territorial claims beyond their established areas. Smaller clubs either aligned with one side or kept low profiles. This stability did not mean harmony, it meant managed tension. Occasional arrests tied to narcotics, investigations involved members from multiple banners, firearms seizures continued during organized crime operations. Courts processed charges related to trafficking and weapons possession, but there was no province-wide ignition point during this stretch. Inside the loners, maintaining morale during a quiet phase required discipline. Members who joined during the earlier war period carried scars, both literal and structural. Newer members had to be taught that survival was not weakness. The club's identity remained rooted in independence, but independence had to be practiced differently in a province dominated by a single large organization. The international presence continued to provide validation. Chapters in Europe and the United States operated under the Loners banner, preserving the club's status as more than an Ontario remnant. That international footprint helped prevent the narrative that the club had been erased. Toward the mid-2010s, subtle shifts began emerging again in Ontario. Support club growth created friction in certain cities. New prospects appeared under different banners. Social media increased visibility for outlaw imagery in ways that earlier decades had not experienced. Younger members across multiple clubs displayed patches online more openly than previous generations. The Loners did not launch a campaign to challenge the hierarchy during this time, but they did not dissolve either. They maintained enough structure to remain relevant. They held onto their identity through a period where open war would have been unsustainable. The years between 2006 and the early 2020s were not defined by dramatic firefights. They were defined by endurance. The Loners survived an environment that had eliminated other banners. They avoided internal collapse. They maintained chapters in Ontario cities without triggering sustained suppression. By the time the province approached the early 2020s, the assumption across much of Ontario was that the biker war years were history. The hierarchy seemed fixed. Open violence had not returned in years. Law enforcement continued monitoring, but the sense of active territorial battle had faded. That assumption would not hold. The quiet rebuilding phase allowed the Loners to remain present long enough for new friction to surface under different circumstances. The dominance established in the early 2000s had not erased independent identity. It had only forced it underground for a time. When tension resurfaced years later, in cities like Cornwall and Cambridge, it did not emerge from a vacuum. It emerged from a club that had spent over a decade surviving in a province that had once tried to absorb it completely. The tension returns. By the early 2020s, Ontario no longer looked like it was in the middle of a biker war. The hierarchy had been stable for years. Chapters operated under established banners. Police units monitored organized crime activity as part of routine enforcement. Most residents did not expect daylight confrontations between rival motorcycle clubs in commercial parking lots. That changed in stages. In August 2022, the Ontario Provincial Police and municipal forces in Kingston and Brockville executed search warrants tied to growing friction between outlaw motorcycle clubs operating in eastern Ontario. The warrants were not random sweeps. They followed intelligence, indicating rising tension between the Loners and rival groups in the region, including the outlaws. Firearms and other prohibited items were seized. Arrests were made. The details signaled that the old balance was being tested in certain cities. Cornwall became a flashpoint the following year. On July 8, 2023, members associated with the Loners and the Outlaws confronted each other in a commercial parking lot in Cornwall. The meeting did not remain verbal. 2 people were stabbed, 1 person was shot, all 3 survived, but the confrontation was violent and direct. Emergency services responded quickly. Police sealed off the area. Witnesses described a chaotic scene unfolding in a public space. 5 people were arrested in connection with the incident. Charges included weapons-related offenses and assault. Investigators began reviewing surveillance footage from surrounding businesses to reconstruct how the confrontation developed and whether it had been planned or escalated spontaneously. Less than 36 hours later, on July 10th, a fire destroyed the Outlaws clubhouse in Brockville, roughly 100 kilometers from Cornwall. The fire was deemed suspicious. Several nearby homes were damaged, families were displaced. Fire investigators examined the scene for accelerants. Police did not publicly tie the fire directly to the Cornwall confrontation at that moment, but the timing drew attention. The Ontario Provincial Police Biker Enforcement Unit issued warnings following these events. They advised the public not to approach outlaw motorcycle club members and not to wear gang-related clothing or merchandise. The warning reflected concern that tension between clubs could spill into spaces where civilians were present. Throughout late 2023, organized crime units monitored movement between eastern Ontario cities more closely. Surveillance around clubhouses increased. Intelligence sharing between municipal services expanded. The pattern did not resemble the early 2000s yet, but the ingredients were visible: public confrontation, retaliatory fire, and intercity movement. 2024 escalated further. On July 4, 2024, in Hamilton, 4 Hells Angels members and 1 member of the Red Devils Support Club assaulted an individual at an establishment and robbed them of personal property. The Red Devils operate as a primary support club for the Hells Angels, and their involvement signaled coordinated action rather than a spontaneous bar fight. Police executed search warrants on August 21st at Hells Angels and Red Devils clubhouses in Hamilton. Firearms were seized, including shotguns and rifles. Ammunition and body armor were recovered. 5 men between the ages of 34 and 51 were arrested and charged with assault, causing bodily harm and robbery. The seizure of weapons during the raids demonstrated preparedness beyond simple intimidation. The most visible incident occurred later that year. On September 21, 2024, in Cambridge, Ontario, members of the Hells Angels and their Red Devils allies confronted members of the Loners in a downtown public parking lot in the early afternoon. Families and children were present in the area. The confrontation escalated quickly. Loners members were robbed of their vests and patches. In outlaw motorcycle culture, taking a rival's colors is a direct act of humiliation and dominance. Police moved quickly in the days that followed. On October 17th, coordinated raids were carried out in Cambridge and Kitchener. A week later, additional searches were conducted in Seaforth and Whitby. During these operations, 17 firearms were seized, along with magazines, ammunition, and a prohibited weapon known as a get-back whip, a weighted leather strap used as a weapon. Stolen property and electronic devices were also recovered. 5 men were charged. 4 were alleged Hells Angels members. 1 was affiliated with the Red Devils. Charges included robbery, possession of property obtained by crime, theft, unauthorized possession of firearms, and disguise with intent. 1 suspect remained wanted on an active warrant following the raids. Court documents later confirmed that the victims in Cambridge were members of the Loners Motorcycle Club. The robbery of patches was not random theft. It was a territorial message delivered in daylight. The public nature of the Cambridge incident distinguished it from the quieter rebuilding years. The confrontation occurred in a commercial area, not an isolated rural meeting place or a closed-door clubhouse. The seizure of 17 firearms following the raids reinforced that the participants were not unarmed opportunists. Across eastern and southwestern Ontario, police increased patrols near known biker locations after the Cambridge raids. Organized crime units worked across jurisdictions to track movements between cities such as Cornwall, Hamilton, Cambridge, and Brockville. Intelligence gathering focused on whether the incidents represented isolated clashes or the beginning of a sustained escalation. Unlike the early 2000s, the province did not immediately descend into months of continuous arson and shootings after Cambridge. But the pattern of 2023 and 2024 showed something that had not been visible in years: direct, public confrontations between established outlaw banners. The Loners, after more than a decade of measured operation, were once again involved in open disputes in Ontario cities. The Hells Angels, through both full-patch members and support clubs, demonstrated willingness to enforce dominance in visible spaces. By the end of 2024, Ontario's biker environment no longer felt dormant. It felt active again, though not yet in the same sustained manner as 2001 and 2002. Arrests were pending, trials were approaching, surveillance remained elevated. Movement between cities was being monitored more closely than it had been in years. The quiet phase had ended. Whether it would escalate into something larger remained uncertain, but the pattern of Cornwall, Hamilton, and Cambridge showed that the tension that began decades earlier had not disappeared. It had resurfaced in public view. Ontario after Cambridge. By the end of 2024, Ontario was not in a declared biker war, but it was no longer in a quiet phase either. The events in Cornwall, Hamilton, and Cambridge forced law enforcement and rival clubs to adjust quickly. The difference between the early 2000s and the present moment was structure. In the earlier war years, multiple banners fought openly for provincial dominance. In 2024, the hierarchy already existed. The tension now centered on enforcement, visibility, and whether independents could coexist under that hierarchy. After the Cambridge incident, police presence in key cities increased noticeably. Organized crime units, coordinated between Waterloo Region, Hamilton, Eastern Ontario, secondary properties, and affiliated support clubs. Search warrants in late 2024 and early 2025 reflected that broader sweep. Inside the Hells Angels structure, visible presence did not disappear. Public rides continued in some areas, support clubs maintained activity, but movement became more deliberate. Large gatherings were assessed against the risk of heightened surveillance. Known prospects were vetted more carefully. The organization had already consolidated Ontario decades earlier. The question now was not whether it could take control of the province, but whether it could maintain dominance without triggering another cycle of sustained escalation. For the loners, the balance was narrower. The Cambridge robbery of Patches was a public challenge. Maintaining identity after such an incident required internal cohesion. Chapters in Ontario continued operating, but visible posture was adjusted. Public appearances were measured. Internal meetings emphasized discipline and caution. Independence remained central to the club's identity, but operating in a province where enforcement and rival attention were elevated required restraint. Eastern Ontario, particularly around Cornwall and Brockville, remained sensitive corridors. The stabbing and shooting in July 2023 and the suspicious fire that followed had already drawn attention to that region. After Cambridge, investigators watched for movement between southwestern and eastern cities that might indicate coordinated retaliation. So far, sustained cycles of retaliation had not materialized, but tension did not disappear. Support clubs played a quiet but significant role in the present balance. Groups aligned with larger banners expanded recruitment pipelines in certain cities. That expansion affected how quickly manpower could be mobilized if confrontation escalated. Law enforcement tracked these support networks closely, knowing that full-patch members often rely on support clubs to apply pressure without direct exposure. The illicit economy underlying the biker environment continued operating during this period. Narcotics distribution networks in Ontario did not stop because of public confrontation. Ports in Hamilton and Windsor remained strategic for trafficking routes. Urban centers such as Toronto and Ottawa continued serving as distribution hubs. Control over these networks rarely shows up in public altercations, but it drives much of the tension beneath them. Financial investigations intensified alongside criminal enforcement. Authorities examined businesses suspected of laundering proceeds from drug distribution and other organized activities. Vehicle dealerships, tattoo shops, and nightlife establishments across multiple cities remained under observation when linked to known members. Asset seizure became part of the strategy, aiming to disrupt revenue rather than waiting for visible violence. Public perception shifted after Cambridge. Residents who had not thought about biker conflict in years saw footage of daylight confrontation and read about firearms seizures tied to organized clubs. Municipal leaders faced pressure to address concerns about safety in commercial districts. Police chiefs emphasized coordinated enforcement and intelligence-led monitoring. Despite the renewed tension, Ontario did not immediately enter a province-wide firefight. The difference between 2001 and 2024 lay partly in experience. Both clubs had already seen what sustained war looked like. Both had absorbed law enforcement pressure during past escalations. Open conflict at the scale of the early 2000s would invite a level of coordinated crackdown that neither side could ignore. The present balance, therefore, rested on deterrence and positioning. The Hells Angels maintained structural dominance across Ontario. The Loners maintained independent identity in selected cities. Support clubs operated as buffers and recruitment pipelines. Law enforcement maintained surveillance and readiness. The situation remained active but contained. Whether containment holds depends on several variables. Court outcomes from 2024 cases could affect membership stability. Further confrontations in public spaces could trigger stronger enforcement measures. Shifts in recruitment patterns could alter manpower calculations in certain cities. For now, the province stands in a tense equilibrium rather than an open war. Ontario's biker conflict did not end in 2006. It entered a quieter phase that lasted more than a decade. 2023 and 2024 demonstrated that the underlying rivalry remained. The difference is that today's conflict unfolds under heavier surveillance, faster information flow, and a public that no longer assumes the issue is buried in the past. The province is not burning as it did in the early 2000s, but the hierarchy that was built decades ago is still being tested, city by city. What happens next will depend less on history and more on whether current tensions escalate beyond controlled confrontation